Oopsie. Make sure those don't get in the way. All right. So I don't want to go through all of Newman's stuff that he'll go through Monday, but this is a really cool tool that I found to make your Ansible playbooks foolproof. So this can be testing like you would test your software, but for your playbooks. Sounds so great, right? Yeah. So I'm Nathaniel Beckstead. I love automation and infrastructure, and my favorite ice cream flavor is mint chocolate chip. And oh, some mint chocolate chip fans.
Good choice.
And I just got a new rack, a real rack, last weekend. Real boy. All right, so first let's talk about just general what Ansible is, because I'm sure some of you haven't used it or just flat out don't know what it is. It's configuration management software, like Chef, if you heard of it, or I think Puppet is too, maybe. And it manages your servers. It can deploy your applications and configure services. And it connects all through SSH or WinRM if you're configuring Windows. And at the very base layer, it executes tasks. So you can make a user, you can start a service, you can download a file, and it'll all do that in a playbook, which we'll talk about later. And it's all written in Python, which of course makes it great. All of Ansible's configuration is in YAML, which stands for, I just learned this, YAML Ain't Markup Language. So what is it? It's not a markup language, believe it or not. It's data serialization format like JSON or XML. It's a way to store data. So it's commonly used for configuration file formats, but it can just store your normal data as well. So this is just real basic data storage of student subproperties, like first name, last name. This is a list because it has dashes, stuff like that. And that's really what a Ansible playbook and tasks and things look like. It also has an inventory, which is where you keep your hosts, which is all the servers that you're going to run your configuration on. And that's in the INI format, which you have a group and then all of the hosts that belong to that group. And you can have some variables in that. But the thing you want to get down is there's hosts. We're just going to establish some vocabulary here. We talked about tasks a little bit. That's your single action. It uses a module. And then above that, you have roles, which is a list of tasks. And it's one kind of thing. So I want to install and configure Nginx. That'll be installing the package, copying your files over, starting the service. And then a playbook connects all of your roles to a host. So this is a real basic playbook. You have your web servers that you want to run. You want to include this role with these variables. So how do we test this? Well, let's talk about just what general testing is first. It's reliable. It'll do the same thing over and over again because it's just a configuration. And it's simultaneous. You can test on a lot of different operating systems, browsers if you're doing web apps, and a whole bunch of other stuff in parallel. And it's available 24/7. Every time you make a commit at 3 a.m., it'll be there to test your commit for you. So how do we test Ansible Playbook specifically? Well, can't you just run the playbook to test it? You could, but you need some infrastructure to run the playbook on. And that's where the big challenge comes in. So testing manually, you could run it on your production servers to test. I wouldn't recommend that. But you can create a test server, and you'll have to set up access and make the operating system and run your commands manually, log in, check for your behavior, and then reset it when you want to test it again. So this is where Molecule comes in. It's run by MetaCloud, who was acquired by Cisco, and they do a lot of OpenStack work, which is like your private AWS on-premise cloud software. and their GitHub's full of Ansible tools as well as OpenStack stuff. So molecule tests roles. So you can create a role using this command. It'll first install it with pip, and then use this command, and the -r is the role name, and I just use GOS as my verifier. We'll talk about that later. But this is going to start from scratch. So when you have a new project and you want to use Ansible, you'll want to make a new role with this. And that creates all of your file structure for Ansible. And all of this is Ansible configuration, and then here's your molecule configuration. And we'll talk about what each of these playbooks does. And you can also test your existing roles using a scenario rather than creating the whole role from scratch. So what does molecule test specifically? It does style and syntax through linting. It'll run your playbook and make sure that it doesn't just fail. And then it'll also test for idempotence, which we heard about from Joe and Anthony before, which is running the same thing over and over again, and it won't make any changes if it's already run once. You can also test it, like we said, on varying operating systems, distributions. Molecule really leaves it open to test on a lot of different platforms, as well as use different testing frameworks. So here's the steps that we'll go through when we want to run molecule test. And we'll talk about what each one of these does. First of all is your linting, which tests your style and syntax. It uses YAML Lint for testing all of your YAML files, and whether those are configurations or for another application that you're using. It'll just check that that's up to spec. And then it uses Flake 8 for your Python scripts. So one of the other verifiers is testinfra, which uses Python unit testing. And so it'll check that for the PEP 8 style. And then Ansible Lint will check your Ansible playbooks. So YAML knows about the specific syntax of just plain old YAML. Ansible Lint knows about what's a module, how does this module run, and what's required for that. So it'll make sure that your stuff will run before it's even run, which is what linting is. And I love and hate that molecule is strict by default. So even if you have a trailing white space, it'll shut everything down and yell at you, which is kind of annoying, but it really makes you make the best playbook possible. So I had, I guess you're supposed to end with a new line after your playbooks, and I feel like it's every time that I forget that new line. I don't know why it matters, but it's the best playbook out there. Next, it destroys any pre-existing infrastructure that molecule set up from a previous test. So you can run each of these steps individually too. So if you've run a test and just started some infrastructure and then try to run it again, it'll destroy that and start up with a new clean box if you've forgotten to do that yourself. And then there's the dependency stage, which I haven't used a whole lot, but it'll pull in any roles from Ansible Galaxy, or they have their own called Guilt, or you can run just a shell command to download a Git repo and include that as well. And then that'll check those roles for syntax as well using Ansible's native check syntax flag, just as another precaution in case Ansible Lint or some other tool that they've included is outdated. Now we get to the cool stuff, the create stage. So this is where your testing infrastructure actually gets spun up. It uses different drivers, like Docker is the default, which will run locally on your machine and make containers. You can set it up for Azure, AWS, Google Compute, or Vagrant if you want to do actual VMs on your machine as well. And it provisions all that through Ansible, which has cloud modules. So if you didn't know, you can actually create infrastructure through an Ansible playbook, which is really cool. And that creates an instance, and it'll do all of the host configuration as well as all the access. And so you just have to tell it, I want to name it this name, and here's the image to pull, and it'll set up everything else for you. And then there's a prepare stage. So if you had software running on your enterprise computers by default, or your role changes something in your website and you want to install your website before testing this specific role, it'll run those in this playbook. And then Converge. And I guess it's called this because it converges your playbook on all of your instances. So this is just running your playbook like normal on all of your instances in parallel, which is cool to watch. It doesn't really do much besides make sure that your Ansible playbook doesn't fail. And then it tests for idempotence. So there's a definition from Ansible if you want to read it, but it basically makes sure if I run it once and then run it again, it doesn't change anything. And it does that by just making sure that your tasks aren't changed when it runs a second time. So task can exit OK, skipped, failed, or changed. And so normally you'd want to use a when parameter on everything so you aren't just running a task every time, no matter what. And then there's side effects, which I've only been able to find one example of on the internet, which is testing high availability. So I think of them as post tasks. So Ansible will make sure that Nginx is started, and it'll say, okay, I ran systemd start Nginx. And then you can come in with a side effect and make sure that Nginx is actually running as you want. And if you have high availability like this, you can take one down and make sure that the others are still running. Things like that. I've never really used it. It's disabled by default, but it's there if the case arises. And now the actual testing. So there's verify, which is running your unit tests. There's a lot of different verifiers. So test infra is the default, and that's written in Python using this unit testing kind of style. So define a file called etc host, and then make sure it exists. The user and group is root. Here's one for GOS, which I like because it's in YAML. And so all of my configuration is pretty much in YAML. And so if I'm using the SSHD service, make sure that it's enabled and running, that I have a user that exists, and you can specify the exact user ID and group ID and a whole bunch of other properties about it. And then when you're done testing, it'll destroy everything. If you want to debug, because normally if it encounters an error anyway along the way, it'll just destroy your instances, which doesn't really help if you need to go in and find what went wrong. So you can just destroy never to keep them up. So let's demo this. This one actually doesn't work because it works on CentOS, but then I added Ubuntu, and now it doesn't work for some reason. Shouldn't have changed it like an hour ago, but here's what the output looks like because it takes 2 or 3 minutes to run. So each one of these little arrows is kind of the start of a new step. So we're linting with YAML lint and Ansible lint, and then destroying nothing, which each step is just an Ansible playbook as well. So you can go in and customize things if you really want to. And then we'll do dependency. Nothing's there, so it just skips that. And then create. So it logs into your Docker registry. If you have that set up, it'll pull Docker files. So you can create your own Docker files too if you want to test things on as well. And then builds the Ansible compatible image. So setting up access for that and installing Python and whatever else Ansible needs. And creates all the Docker stuff. And then we'll run our playbook. So this installs Redis, which I've been working on a while just to test it out. and this is running on Ubuntu and CentOS, like I said, and it copies everything, and it works great the first time, and then idempotence doesn't work for starting the server because I just run the Redis server command, and it doesn't, I guess something's wrong with my configuration, but it doesn't like that. But it verified, which we can go to my verification for that. So here's my verification for Redis. So I install the package through yum or apt, and then have this service file, and you can check for the actual SHA sum and make sure that it's a file and exists and what permissions it has. And you can test that a port's actually listening. And then you can test the command. So Redis has a Redis CLI ping, and it should return Pong if it can connect and operate fine. And there's really not great native documentation for it, but I found some good blog posts that describe things better than just the generated documentation for it. I think this is really cool. It speeds up my role creation a lot and testing. You don't have to create any other infrastructure, and it does all that for you. Any questions? Nick.
The molecule define itself as define itself a lot, but maybe you said Docker.
Yeah. So, yeah, I've thought about using it for that too, because you can run steps individually, so you can just start up a Docker container with that. But I think it's meant for testing. Yeah. The tagline of it is aids in Ansible role creation and development. So it doesn't mention testing, but that's the main part of it. Newman.
See that you're on Windows?
Yeah.
How'd you get it running?
I'm on Bash, and then I have Docker running on Windows and just connect it through that. Yeah. Let me test actually. All right. Maybe it doesn't work on Sigwin. Cool. But yeah, at least works through Bash on Windows. But it's Python, so it should work maybe. I don't know. Anything?
It's interesting because in their documentation, which you would say supported on Windows.
All right. Oh, yeah, that's true.
Suppose if people do subsystems or that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else? Oh, it did work on Windows. Cool. All right, thank you.